You have to look at the scientific proof, and unfortunately, hard evidence at this point isn't forthcoming, but you have to keep an open mind. Today I talked about Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy. He put animals in certain categories. The cat's in the same category as a tiger, and so on. So technically, since the beginning of time, scientists have all been cryptozoologists. We're always finding new animals. Every day there's new species being found. It might be a tiny little insect of some sort, but occasionally there's the huge animal mammal that's found, or huge shark that's found that nobody has known up to this point. So I would say keep an open mind, because this door is still wide open, and there's a lot of people in this country and around the world that are working real hard to prove this mystery.
Hey guys, Daniel here, and I am with Jerry Hestand. Jerry, it's an honor to be here with you.
Thank you, Daniel.
And Jerry's the author of Hunting Apes in America, and this is a really interesting book about the Bigfoot phenomenon that takes place right here in our country, which is a very interesting notion that we don't have just Bigfoot in, like, let's say Washington or the Yeti and Nepal and the Himalayas, but we have Bigfoot right here in the States, and this is an ongoing phenomenon. So we're really glad to be able to have you here at the 8th Annual Texas Metaphysical and Paranormal Unity Fest, where we have all kinds of different talks on different subjects, and you gave a talk earlier on folklore and fact when it comes to Bigfoot. So tell us a little bit about your talk.
Well, in my talk today, I talked about Bigfoot, fact versus folklore, and honestly, it has to be one or the other. I've been a researcher since 2001, and I've seen a lot of strange things, and I believe I've come up with some evidence that points towards the Bigfoot being an actual living animal in North America, but I don't have any proof, and until we have some proof of the animal actually existing, it probably is in folklore. So I've been interested in the subject for many years. I wrote this book because my friends would say, hey, you've got these great stories, so we sit around the campfire to investigation, why don't you put these stories down in a book? And I eventually had some free time to write the book down. It was easy. I already had the investigations and tons of pictures. I just had to put it in a form where people would find it interesting.
Right, and so when we're dealing with these fascinating stories, and a lot of them are so great that they become movies or shows that we all know about, and that's really awesome. Sometimes it can be difficult to go and look in and find the tangible evidence that shows that they're beyond just stories, but they're fact as well, and they're part of our history. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the things that you can find when it comes to investigating these cases that show, well, maybe this one's a little bit more of a fun story, or maybe there is some truth to this one?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the group that I'm in now, the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, we have a list of priorities that we go by as far as reports. And the most important ones to us are people that we feel are trustworthy, that have some sort of evidence that they can give to us. And then the ones that are less credible, sometimes we don't even investigate, because unfortunately there are some hoaxers out there and just some wild stories. But as an investigator, one of my number one priorities is going to an area where there have been sightings, a history of sightings, because I don't want to waste my time going from one, state park to another park to another park to other people's property where these animals may have moved on. So I'm looking for a legitimate breeding population in a certain part of the country, and that's where I want to do my work, and that's where I've had my luck. For example, I talk about Area X today, and in Area X there's been a long history of sightings. We've heard vocalizations, there's been plaster casts. We've had these animals come up to us starting in the spring for just sometimes on a weekly basis. And we've had so many sightings that it's hard to explain it away. But then on the other hand, we don't have any tangible proof, which would be DNA. And also in other parts of the country, like Falk, Arkansas, you have the famous legend of Boggy Creek. That's another area that I've researched and come up with some pretty startling evidence that there's probably a viable population there. And even in South Texas, in the Big Thicket, Sam Houston National Forest, and Davy Crockett National Forest, you just connect the dots of the riverways and the forest and the rainfall, and you can see that there's a possibility that there's an unknown animal out there.
So there's a lot going on, a lot of activity here, even in Texas, and that can surprise a lot of people that aren't familiar with that, because when you think about Bigfoot, you think maybe mountains and way up north and the Pacific Northwest. And so when we're talking about down south, there's so much to really take into consideration as far as our environment, the different rivers, as you were pointing out earlier, and all the different pathways that can lead to how we understand what kind of creatures that we're dealing with and the different climates that they range in. And so when we're talking about Texas, for instance, and all these places that you're mentioning, you have so many people coming forward and coming to these conferences. And I know you've been a big part of the Texas Bigfoot conferences throughout the years and the research organizations. So when people come out and they're not here just for the great stories, sometimes they have something that they've experienced as well, and they feel like they're in a supporting group to be able to be open and to be able to feel like they're not going to be ridiculed. And so when you have scores of people coming and they're all saying the same thing or something very similar about their sighting, I think it starts to open people's minds a little bit to the possibility that there is something out there, even here in our state, Texas. And so what have you found in your research and in your investigations when it comes to places here in the South, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, that might be different from Bigfoot cases, let's say up north?
Well, up north and here in the South and in Texas, there's undeniable sets of patterns. So, for example, along the Red River, I've had reports from people that the reports span decades. They don't know each other, they've never met each other, read my book, but they have sightings in basically the same area 10 or 15 miles away from each other, up and down the Red River. In the Sulphur River, there was a book or a magazine called Fate Magazine that had an article in the mid-'80s talking about Bigfoot near Greenville, Texas. And when we started investigating in 2002, that's where we began, because people were giving us these reports. So there's not that much difference as far as the Pacific Northwest and Texas, as far as the animals and the sightings, but I think we have a different type of animal living here in the South. I think they may be more aggressive and are willing more to come up to people and scare them out of their area. And I think that's the key right there. The only reason a Bigfoot would interact with people on a steady basis is because, like chimpanzees, they don't want humans in their area. Like chimpanzees, they'll knock on wood to signal each other, and they'll imitate other animals like chimpanzees and other great apes. So what we're finding, not only in patterns of sightings in areas, but we're finding patterns of these animals doing exactly the same thing as the great apes, such as chimpanzees and gorillas. So in the South, they're more aggressive, and you may even be luckier to see one in the fact that we have all the roadways interspersed in the forest, whereas in the Pacific Northwest, you have such vast stretches of forested land that no one ever goes to.
Yeah, and this isn't a recent phenomenon, even though it does still happen. This goes way back, and we do have what seems to be some of these stories dating back into the 1800s. And this is kind of where some of those lines between fact and folklore might blur. So in your studies, what are some of the earlier recordings of these encounters?
Well, you know, the Native Americans have known about these animals for centuries. My colleague, Kathy Strain-Moskowitz, wrote a book about how every major Native American group has a name for Bigfoot from Washington State to Florida. And I find that compelling. It's not just folklore. They say this is another tribe of people that are covered with hair, that want to be left alone and don't want to be bothered. So in Texas and Oklahoma, fellow researchers and I have talked to Native American groups, and they've said, yes, these things have been here, since we've been here. We've known about them. There's a place in Oklahoma, Concho, where these animals have been passing through their land every spring. And it seems like spring is the time that we have a lot of sightings. So from Native Americans to J. Frank Dobie, which is the father of Texas folklore back in the 1800s, he talked about the wild woman of Navidad, who was a hair-covered wild woman that would come up to other farmhouses and steal things. We found reports even all across the state in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, especially in Falk, Arkansas. My friend Lyle Blackburn did some really good research and found some old newspaper accounts. And my friend Marvin Leeper in Atoka County, Oklahoma, has found some old newspaper reports from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Yeah,
so there's a whole lot that's been going on, and we can only imagine all the sightings that weren't recorded or reported to any newspapers or anything. So this is something that we still have to keep in mind today, is that when we do have the reports that are out there, that's only a fraction of the sightings that are actually taking place, because they're not always reported. So that's one of the big issues with what we're dealing with, is that sometimes someone might have an encounter out there, and because of many things like the ridicule factor or just being too scared or whatever it is, they might never share it with anybody, and that can be unfortunate. But for those that do, it gives us a little bit of information on not just the location, but many different things that, more details they can provide with, all kinds of different regional issues and these different things. So what would you say are some of the different types of evidence that we could look for when it comes to these creatures?
There's so much evidence, in what scientists would consider soft evidence. In other words, we don't have the body of a Bigfoot, on a dissection table to be put in the proper category. There's evidence such as footprint cast. My friend Jimmy Chilcutt, who's a CSI investigator, has actually found dermal ridges in plaster cast, microscopic dermal ridges in plaster cast. That's pretty compelling. There's been a lot of hair samples submitted, and none of it has really come forward. So things like that aren't really hard evidence. We have now in my group, we have some scientists that are examining some of the vocalizations that we're recording. One of them has his graduate students listen to what we record, and we've got some very high sensitive recorders out in the field, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and they can determine, say, this is an owl. It sounds weird, but this is an owl. This is a fox. It sounds weird, but it's a fox. Now these sounds, we don't know what they are. We've gone through the entire catalog of known animal sounds, and they don't match. So when our teams go out into the area and investigate, they say, look, ignore these sounds. They're owls and foxes. However, if you hear these sounds, they could be an unknown primate. Also, in the world of science, there's a new thing called eDNA. In other words, environmental DNA. And environmental DNA is where you can take water from a track or mud from a track, and you can actually get the DNA of the animal that made the track. So that's something new that we're going to be trying this year.
So there's several different parts to the whole that we're trying to build a case for. And I think that if you brought this into court of law, it seems like if you brought in enough of these sort of anecdotal pieces of evidence, that hopefully you'd have some conclusion that there is something out there. I'm really hopeful that maybe we can continue finding these things, if not the smoking gun, of course. But what would you say so far has been, it proves to be the best sort of specimen that we have so far that would say that definitively this is what we're dealing with?
It would just have to be the compilation of all the information, just everything. Just take everything into account and the patterns that you see. And Craig Woolheater, a friend of mine who started the Texas Bigfoot Conference, said from thousands and thousands of people that have reported seeing these animals, they can't all be lying. As a matter of fact, Craig said, if just one person is telling the truth, then it's got to be real.
And that changes the scope of what we know for not just cryptozoology, but biology in general, and genetics, and so many different aspects of science and medicine. So I think that we're sort of on the brink of making these new discoveries, because we have so many more people in the field looking to do this work, to get the information out there, but also to be careful about this process. So what would you say for people that have an encounter? What kind of message would you give to them, or advice?
If I was going to give somebody advice about having an encounter, I would, as quickly as I could, contact my group, the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, or the BFRO, or some of these other people that can send some people out just as quickly as they can, because these are real animals and they don't stay in one place for very long, with few exceptions. So I would say contact a group that you're sure is legitimate and will take your sighting seriously.
So for people who've had a recent encounter, or who've had a historical one that happened way back when, they can go and file that with your organization and hopefully get some follow-up about maybe more sightings in the area, or have someone like you go out to the location and do some field research to see what might be able to be found out in that area.
Yeah, there's a guy in our group by the name of Ed Harrison. He's a statistician, and he's done some incredible work. He's looked at all the different areas, all the different times, the moon phases, the weather changes, all of these things, and put them into a database. So even if you had a encounter in 1963, we can put it in that database and quickly pull up, does it sound legitimate? Has there been anything to follow up with that? Scientifically, does it meet the criteria that we look for as far as, other reports, the rainfall amount, which is a big thing, the amount of forest around the area, food sources, things like that.
Great. So when we're looking at the difference between some of these fantastic stories and what we have as hard evidence, even if it's the soft evidence that we're talking on, what are some of the main differences that you might be able to spot out when you hear some of these stories? What are some of the things that you could say that definitely seem to fall more into the folklore category?
I hate to give my secret information away, but hoaxers have this preponderancy to start embellishing. In other words, they'll give you a story, incredible story, you'll investigate it, and before you know it, they've had another encounter and another encounter and another encounter, and before you know it and you look into it deeper, it's just a huge hoax. And unfortunately, we've been hoaxed 2 or 3 times before, but we are so experienced now that we feel that we can ferret out most of the hoaxers and try to get on with the real science.
So what are your thoughts on when people, the hoaxers out there, they do these things? Do you feel it's a disservice to the study overall? Do you think it's kind of muddying the waters or causing more confusion?
Yes, it just makes us all look bad. There's a lot of TV shows, and some of the documentaries are pretty good, and some of them are so ridiculous it's embarrassing to watch. So those shows aren't helping us at all. There's a lot of videos on YouTube, and some of them could be real, absolutely, but some of them are so ridiculous it's embarrassing, and it's not helping us, it's just hurting us. And we have to wade through all of this to try to get to what's real.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed, like you said earlier, and what Craig had mentioned, out of all these people that have had these sightings, even if just one of them is actually telling the truth, and hopefully most of them are, then that changes the scope of what we're dealing with. So can people go to find out about your book and the organizations that you're a part of?
Well, you can go to my website, www.jerryhestand.com. You can go to NAWAC or woodape.org, and you can look at tons and tons of information from woodape.org and the NAWAC website. Even a possible probable picture from central Oklahoma that we've collected. So there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of information. It's exciting that, you know, in the age now, that there's so much that you can go to and learn from. But I would warn those that are listening to us now to be very careful and be very, very skeptical, because even some of the organizations in the country right now may not be looking at things that are real. They may be seeing things that are in their imagination.
Sure. So as a send-off, what would you say to those, the naysayers, as it were, that think this is all nonsense and maybe that Bigfoot's not real and just made up? What would you say to those people?
I would say I don't blame you. I mean, you have to look at the scientific proof, and unfortunately, hard evidence at this point isn't forthcoming, but you have to keep an open mind. Today I talked about Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy. He put animals in certain categories. The cat's in the same category as a tiger, and so on. So technically, since the beginning of time, scientists have all been cryptozoologists. We're always finding new animals. Every day there's new species being found. It might be a tiny little insect of some sort, but occasionally there's the huge animal that, you know, mammal that's found, or huge shark that's found that nobody has known up to this point. So I would say keep an open mind, because this door is still wide open, and there's a lot of people in this country and around the world that are working real hard to prove this mystery.
Well, it's very well said, and I like to think that we won't know if we don't go. So
exactly.
Let's get out there and see what we can find, make new discoveries.
That's right.
So Jerry, thanks for being here today.
You're
It's
welcome.
been an honor, and we'll have to have you back here for next time.
Okay, thanks a lot.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the Vortex.